Staying is not about giving in, losing control, or compromising their sense of self. It's about redefining what safety means. For the avoidant, safety has always meant space and control. But in a healthy, loving relationship, safety can also mean being seen, being accepted, and being connected, even with all the flaws, fears, and imperfections. Choosing to stay becomes an act of defiance against their past, against the belief that closeness always leads to pain. And this choice isn't easy. To stay means tolerating discomfort. It means sitting in the anxiety that comes when emotional walls begin to lower. It means not having all the answers and still allowing yourself to be part of the conversation. But that discomfort is also growth. It's expansion. It's the nervous system learning that intimacy doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can be grounding, stabilizing, even healing. Each time an avoidant person chooses to stay instead of shut down, they build new neural pathways, ones that say, it's okay to be here, I can handle this, I can connect and still be safe. This process doesn't happen overnight. There are steps forward and steps back. There are moments when the old pattern takes over. But every choice to re-engage, every instance of leaning in instead of checking out, sends a message not just to their partner, but to themselves. I'm capable of intimacy. I'm capable of staying. That's what makes this decision so powerful. It's not flashy or loud. It's not a dramatic confession of love or an overnight transformation. It's quiet resilience. It's courage in the most human form, the courage to try again, to stay even when the instinct is to run, to speak even when the words feel tangled, to reach out even when it feels unfamiliar. And perhaps most importantly, when they choose to stay, they begin to experience something new, a love that doesn't demand perfection, a connection that welcomes their presence, and a sense of safety that comes not from isolation, but from being accepted as they are. This is the moment avoidant individuals stop surviving love and start participating in it, not just as observers, but as equal, open-hearted partners. For someone with avoidant tendencies, love often brings up a paradox. The very thing they want, closeness, intimacy, connection, is also what triggers their deepest fears. At the core of avoidant attachment is a learned belief that being truly seen is dangerous. That if they expose their real thoughts, needs, or vulnerabilities, they'll be judged, rejected, controlled, or worse, abandoned. So instead of leaning into love, they protect themselves from it, not consciously or maliciously, but instinctively. And the way they protect themselves is by staying hidden, staying distant, staying emotionally unavailable. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. It feels safer to remain behind a mask, to only show the strong, composed, logical version of themselves. The parts that are messy, unsure, or emotional get tucked away, locked behind years of self-protection. But that safety comes at a cost, because you can't experience real intimacy if you're not willing to be seen. And love, real love, requires exactly that exposure, not just to your best self, but to your whole self. Fighting for love then requires the avoidant person to do the very thing they've avoided for so long, to let someone in, not just in the surface level way of sharing a few facts or being physically present, but in the deeper emotional way of saying, this is who I am and I'm trusting you with it. That kind of openness is terrifying for someone who's learned that vulnerability equals danger. But it's also the only way forward. Letting go of emotional self-protection doesn't mean becoming emotionally raw or dependent overnight. It doesn't mean swinging to the other extreme of oversharing or abandoning boundaries. It means slowly, intentionally choosing to let someone see more of you, your doubts, your fears, your hopes, your confusion. It means answering honestly when your partner asks how you feel, even if your voice shakes. It means staying in the hard conversation instead of shutting down or walking away. It means saying, I'm scared, instead of hiding behind silence or detachment. This shift is not about becoming a different person. It's about finally giving yourself permission to be your whole person, to be complex, to have needs, to admit you care. Avoidants often think that needing someone makes them weak, but that's the lie they were taught, a belief they had to adopt in order to survive emotionally. But love doesn't punish neediness. Healthy love welcomes it. It makes space for it. And when the avoidant person finally realizes that the need to stay protected starts to soften. Fighting for love also means realizing that connection will never be perfectly safe, but it can be worth it. Vulnerability always carries a risk. There are no guarantees. But living behind a wall guarantees something else: a disconnection, loneliness, and the constant ache of what could have been. At some point, the fear of being hurt becomes less painful than the regret of never trying, and that's where everything begins to shift. When the avoidant person stops trying to control how they are perceived and instead chooses to simply be in the relationship, messy, unsure, but present, they begin to experience love in a new way. They stop managing it like a risk and start allowing it to be an experience. They learn that being seen doesn't have to lead to rejection, that love can hold space for their fear and still not leave, that they can show up as their full, imperfect selves and still be chosen. This is the turning point, the moment when fear no longer runs the show, the moment when protection gives way to connection, When the need to stay hidden gives way to the deeper need to be loved, not for the version of themselves they thought they had to be, but for who they truly are. And when that happens, love stops being something to run from and becomes something worth fighting for. So here we are. We've talked about fear, about distance, about walls built not out of hatred, but out of hurt. We've looked into the heart of the avoidant, not with judgment, but with understanding. And what we've seen is not someone incapable of love, but someone terrified of what love might cost. But something changes when they stop running. Something powerful happens when, for the first time, they say, I want to stay. Not because it's easy, not because they've suddenly figured it all out, but because the fear of being vulnerable finally becomes smaller than the pain of being alone. And in that moment, that choice to stay, to lean in, to be present, everything begins to shift, not just for them, but for the relationship, because now love isn't one-sided. It's mutual, it's earned, it's fought for. So if you are someone loving an avoidant, your patience, your presence, and your boundaries matter. You cannot save them, but you can inspire them. And if you are the avoidant, your fear doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. But your courage to show up anyway. That's what makes you unstoppable, because real love doesn't need perfection. It just needs someone willing to take the risk, to stay, to fight, to try again. And that quiet, brave decision is how an avoidant finally learns to fight for the relationship. Thank you. Thank you for showing up today. Not just to this message, but to the work. Whether you're healing, holding space, or learning to drop your own armor, your willingness to grow matters more than you know. So keep going. Because the kind of love you're working toward, it's already inside you. You're not too late. You're not too broken. You're just getting started. Thank you. Sometimes in life we run, not because we're cowards, not because we don't care, but because we never learned how to stay. We armor up with silence. We dodge intimacy with logic. We say, I need space, when what we really mean is, I'm terrified that if I let you close, you'll see the parts of me I can't even look at. But there comes a day, a moment, a crack in the wall that's been built brick by brick over years of pain, fear, and false independence. And through that crack, a light enters. You see someone not just trying to love you, but fighting for you. And something shifts, not overnight, not with fireworks, but subtly like ice melting in the sun. You realize running hasn't protected you. It's just kept you lonely. You realize this person sees your fear and doesn't flinch. And for the first time, maybe ever, you ask yourself, what would it take for me to stay? What would it take for me to stop fighting love and start fighting for it? And here's the truth. When you stop running, when you finally say, this matters more than my fear, that's when everything changes. Because when an avoidant chooses to stay, chooses to lean in instead of pull away, that's not weakness. That's the greatest act of courage they will ever take. And it means they're finally ready to fight, not against love, but for it. Most people misunderstand avoidant behavior in relationships. They see someone pulling away and assume it's a sign of disinterest, selfishness, or even emotional coldness. But beneath that quiet withdrawal, that emotional distance, there's often something much deeper. Not a lack of love, but a deeply rooted fear of vulnerability. Avoidant individuals are not broken, and they're not incapable of love. In fact, many of them feel things incredibly deeply, sometimes more than they can handle. But what they've learned, often from a very young age, is that closeness can be dangerous. Maybe they grew up in an environment where love came with conditions. Maybe every time they opened up, they were shamed, ignored, or left. Maybe they were taught that emotions make you weak and independence is the only safety. So they adapted, they became self-reliant, hyper-independent, emotionally guarded. And when relationships began to demand more intimacy, more openness, more emotional availability, that's when the old alarm bells started going off. Not because they didn't want closeness, but because closeness reminded them of past pain. For them, letting someone in doesn't feel like connection. It feels like stepping into a war zone without armor. What looks like disconnection is often self-protection. They may pull away not to hurt you, but to keep themselves from feeling exposed, from losing control. They may need space not because they don't care, but because caring so much overwhelms them. Love, in its raw form, stirs up all the buried feelings they've spent years trying to contain. And when that emotional flood comes, they retreat not because they're running from you, but because they're running from the feelings you awaken in them. This is why pushing an avoidant partner to just open up or talk about your feelings can backfire. It feels like pressure. It feels unsafe, not because they don't want to share, but because they don't yet know how to feel safe doing it. Their nervous system has been trained to associate vulnerability with danger. So even small moments of closeness can feel like a threat even when their heart longs for connection. What avoidant people often need is not to be fixed, but to be seen, to have their internal experience understood, not judged. Because the truth is, many avoidants are incredibly loyal, loving, and committed, But their love language doesn't look like traditional emotional expression. It may look like showing up in practical ways. It may look like consistency. It may look like saying little, but meaning everything. The love is there, it's just wrapped in armor. The shift happens when they start to feel emotionally safe, when they realize that being close to someone doesn't mean being consumed or controlled, when they begin to understand that they can be fully themselves, fears and all, and still be accepted. That's when the guard starts to drop. That's when the fear of being vulnerable becomes less than the fear of losing something real. So when an avoidant person starts to show signs of change, when they initiate conversation, when they don't disappear during conflict, when they let you into even a sliver of their internal world, know that it's not small, it's massive. For someone who's been hiding their emotions for years, even showing a little bit is a huge act of trust. It's not that they're just suddenly ready, it's that something inside them has shifted from fear to faith, from protection to connection. Understanding this changes the game. It moves the focus from frustration to compassion, from resistance to patience. Because when you realize that avoidant behavior is fear disguised as distance, you stop taking it personally and you start seeing the human underneath. Emotional armor is something we all wear to some extent. It's the coping mechanism we develop when we've been hurt, disappointed, or abandoned. For the avoidant, that armor becomes their identity. It's not just a shield, it's a way of existing in the world. They believe it's what keeps them safe, what keeps them strong, what keeps them in control. But over time, what they think is protecting them is actually the very thing keeping love out. Avoidants often pride themselves on their independence, on not needing anyone, on being unbothered. This becomes their badge of honor. They've taught themselves to survive without closeness, without leaning on anyone emotionally. That may have worked at one point, maybe in childhood, maybe after a heartbreak, but eventually that strategy becomes their prison. What was once a protective response becomes the barrier to everything they truly want: connection, intimacy, trust, belonging. When you build emotional walls high enough, no one can get in. But you also can't get out. That's the irony. The same distance that's supposed to make them feel safe becomes the reason they feel misunderstood, alone, and emotionally starved. It's not because no one cares, it's because no one can reach them behind the fortress they've built. Avoidants often crave connection just as much as anyone else. But the moment it starts to get real, the armor comes back up. Closeness feels threatening, not because the person in front of them is unsafe, but because their nervous system is wired to interpret vulnerability as risk. The safer the relationship becomes, the more their fears surface. Why? Because real intimacy is unfamiliar. Real safety is unsettling when you've spent years surviving by staying in control. So they retreat. They get quiet. They say they need space. They intellectualize their feelings instead of feeling them. They convince themselves that they're better off alone, that needing someone is weakness. They pull away not to punish you, but to manage the discomfort rising inside of them. But the more they do this, the more isolated they become. The more they avoid emotional intimacy, the more they starve the very part of themselves that longs to be seen and loved. The truth is, emotional armor doesn't just block out pain, it also blocks out joy. It numbs everything. And that numbness becomes the default. They might not feel overwhelmed anymore, but they don't feel fully alive either. They miss the depth of love, the warmth of connection, the comfort of being truly known. But to get there, the armor has to come off, and that's terrifying. Taking off that armor doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. It happens when they're met with compassion instead of criticism. It happens when they realize they won't be shamed for being scared. It happens when they see that their feelings, no matter how messy or imperfect, are welcome. Every time they let someone in, even just a little, they take a risk, but with each risk, they chip away at the walls they once thought were protecting them. What they eventually discover is that vulnerability isn't a threat, it's a bridge. It's what transforms relationships from transactional to transformational. It's what allows love to not just exist, but to thrive. And it's not about being emotionally naked all the time. It's about learning that intimacy doesn't require abandoning yourself. It requires trusting that you're enough, even when you're unsure, afraid, or imperfect. The armor was never meant to be permanent. It was built in a time of survival. But love doesn't grow in survival mode. It grows in connection. And the moment they begin to understand that, the healing begins, not because someone fixed them, but because they chose to slowly, courageously let themselves be seen. The moment of change in an avoidant person doesn't come because someone forced them to change. It doesn't happen after endless arguments, emotional pleading, or ultimatums. In fact, pressure usually causes the opposite effect. It makes them withdraw further, tighten their emotional grip, and reinforce their inner walls. True transformation in someone with avoidant tendencies comes from realization, not pressure. It's an internal shift, not an external demand. Avoidant behavior is rooted in fear, not malice. It's a fear of losing control, of being consumed by another person, of being vulnerable and having that vulnerability used against them. So when they're confronted with emotional intensity or demands for closeness, their nervous system interprets that as danger. The more someone pushes for connection, the more unsafe it feels. It's not that they don't care, they care deeply. But caring deeply is exactly what scares them. This is why the breakthrough moment doesn't happen in the heat of a confrontation. It doesn't happen after being told you need to open up or you always run. It happens in quiet moments, often when they're alone. When the dust settles and they're left with the silence, with the emptiness, with the aching absence of the person they pushed away. It's in those still moments that something shifts. That's when they start to ask different questions. Not, how do I protect myself? But what am I really afraid of? And more importantly, what am I losing by holding back? They begin to realize that the safety they thought they were creating by pulling away is actually costing them something precious. They see that their patterns, once useful for survival, are now sabotaging the very thing they want, real connection. That realization doesn't always come as an epiphany. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it creeps in over time through the consistency of someone who doesn't give up on them, or through the pain of losing someone who finally did. What awakens them is not being pushed, but being understood. It's not being called out, but being gently seen. It's someone who says, I know you're scared. I'm not here to change you. I'm just here if you ever decide to show up. That kind of presence, calm, steady, and non-demanding, gives them space to process their feelings without feeling cornered. And it's in that space that change becomes possible. Once they begin to reflect, they often realize that they're not avoiding the other person, they're avoiding their own emotions. They've been running from discomfort, from old wounds, from buried fears they haven't been ready to face. But when they start to see those emotions not as threats, but as invitations to heal, something opens up. They begin to understand that love doesn't have to mean losing themselves. It can mean being more of themselves, but safely, gradually, and authentically. The transformation becomes real when they choose to engage, not because someone demanded it, but because they want to. Because they finally see the cost of staying disconnected is greater than the fear of being close. That's when they reach out. That's when they initiate a conversation they once avoided. That's when they stay present during conflict instead of shutting down. And that's when you know the shift is real, because it's not coming from fear or guilt, but from clarity and courage. Lasting change always comes from within. And for an avoidant person, that inner shift is everything. They won't open up because someone else says they should. They'll open up because they've finally realized that connection is worth the risk, not because love is safe, but because it's worth facing their fear for. There's a common misconception in relationships that you have to be perfectly healed, emotionally fluent, and completely open to be a good partner, especially if you're trying to overcome avoidant tendencies. But the truth is, real connection isn't built on perfection, it's built on presence. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, showing up, really showing up, is often the bravest and most meaningful thing they can do. Avoidants often live with the belief that unless they can do something flawlessly, it's not worth doing at all. That belief stems from deep-seated fears. The fear of being judged, misunderstood, or not enough. Vulnerability feels high risk, and so does imperfection. They often think that unless they can explain their emotions clearly, manage them calmly, and always say the right thing, they shouldn't say anything at all. This creates a kind of emotional paralysis. They become stuck between the longing to connect and the fear of doing it wrong. But presence doesn't require the perfect words. It doesn't require emotional eloquence. It just requires willingness to stay, to try to be seen, even when it feels messy, even when it's uncomfortable. Just being in the room, emotionally available, even if it's imperfect, communicates something powerful. I care enough to try. And that matters so much more than any rehearsed speech or flawless emotional performance. Often avoidants are far more present than they give themselves credit for. They're listening even when they're quiet. They're feeling deeply even when they're not expressing it. But what they sometimes don't realize is that presence doesn't have to look dramatic. It's in the small choices, choosing to stay in the conversation instead of walking away, asking a question instead of shutting down, sitting beside your partner in silence when you don't know what to say but still want to be close. These moments build intimacy far more than the occasional grand gesture or perfectly timed confession. Relationships don't require us to be perfect, but they do ask us to be honest. Presence means being honest about where you are, even if that means saying, I'm not sure how I feel right now, or this is hard for me, but I want to understand. That honesty builds trust, and trust builds safety, the kind of emotional safety that avoidant individuals so desperately need to feel before they can soften their defenses. When an avoidant partner begins to understand that they don't need to have all the answers, it opens the door to a new way of relating. They begin to realize that their value in the relationship isn't measured by how emotionally articulate they are, but by how committed they are to being present, to choosing the relationship even when it feels vulnerable or uncertain. They begin to feel a sense of relief when they learn that showing up, however imperfectly, is enough. Presence is also about consistency. It's not about saying the perfect thing once. It's about choosing to return to the relationship again and again. It's about building reliability in moments when their old pattern would have been to retreat. And every time they choose presence over withdrawal, that new pattern begins to overwrite the old one. Slowly, but surely, they become more at ease with staying, more comfortable with closeness, more confident in their ability to be loved exactly as they are. This shift can feel like a quiet revolution. It's not loud or dramatic, it's subtle, steady, and deeply meaningful. And it proves something crucial, that emotional growth doesn't require a total personality overhaul. It just requires the courage to show up again and again, even when you're unsure, even when you're scared, even when you feel far from perfect. Because that effort, that presence, is what builds the foundation of real lasting love. When someone with avoidant tendencies decides to stay in a relationship instead of pulling away, it's not just a small behavioral change, it's a profound inner shift. For a person who's spent their life avoiding emotional closeness to protect themselves, the act of staying, especially during moments of discomfort, conflict, or emotional intensity, is nothing short of transformational. It may look subtle on the outside. A decision to stay in the room, to respond to a difficult message, to meet vulnerability with presence, but on the inside, it's a revolution. Avoidant attachment doesn't form in a vacuum. It often stems from experiences where emotional needs were unmet, closeness felt suffocating, or love was inconsistent and conditional. Over time, the individual learns that emotional distance equals safety. They come to believe that relying on others is dangerous and that self-sufficiency is the only form of protection that works. So in relationships, the moment things get too close or too uncertain, the default response is to create distance. That might look like withdrawing, shutting down, or rationalizing themselves out of their feelings. But when an avoidant person starts to become aware of these patterns, something powerful begins to unfold. They realize that every time they run, they're not just avoiding conflict, they're avoiding connection. They begin to see that their instinct to pull away may have protected them in the past, but now it's blocking them from the very intimacy they crave. And in that moment of clarity, they have a choice: keep running or try something different. When they choose to stay, emotionally, physically, relationally, they're rewriting their story.